So I'm Landon. This presentation is, this presentation that I'm doing is based off of my thesis for IBS, or the Institute of Buddhist Studies. I worked in a rehab after college, and I should not have been working in a rehab. I didn't know that's what I was getting myself into. They didn't tell me, and it became apparent that I would not be able to smoke marijuana because they would probably be drug testing me at this place. So I smoked weed for like 3 years pretty regularly, and so I quit, and I finally admitted, in the interview all they asked was, have you tried drugs? So I didn't lie, I just said, everyone tries marijuana. I know now that that's like manipulation and stuff like that, so I was gonna quit, and I admitted to one of the counselors, and they said you should tell the supervisors, and technically one supervisor wasn't in the meeting, so you didn't really lie to him. He just happens to come in and we talk, and he says, well, we don't want you to leave. Why don't you go back to your temple? And I was like, I don't think that's how that works. And he said, if you are safe enough to walk in, would you be chased out? I'm like, maybe, but I'd be okay with that. And he said, why don't you go back to your church? And that's kind of how we got here today. I am not sober. I want that to be addressed. I don't smoke marijuana anymore, and I don't really drink, but it's because of an autoimmune disorder. I do use hemp. I might have a drink, like a small one once in a blue moon, so I don't want anyone to be like, oh, he's lying to everyone, because I think in addiction recovery, we're supposed to be honest. So this is a thesis. I was going to try to write a 12-step program from the Jodo Shinshu lens, and a couple months into researching, I decided I didn't think our priests should be trying to run a 12-step program, so it became more of how would we supplement people in recovery and using language, but also using skill sets from like case management, mental health, prevention, and recovery services, and cultural anthropology. It all kind of gets mixed into this. So my first book that I ever read specifically on Jodo Shinshu and wanting to know Jodo Shinshu was a book on the Akunin, or the evil person. And Jodo Shinshu, the evil person, is the object of liberation for Amida Buddha. Like the worst of the worst is who Amida wants to liberate the most. I think that working in the rehab changed my life. I realized that I have addict behaviors, but I would also hear stories in these meetings, and they were just so profound, and I would argue spiritual, possibly most likely from a Christian lens point, that I feel like that's something that religion also has to offer. I think people need to keep their sense of self safe. We want to preserve that, but to do that, to live peacefully, we can't shatter what we think about ourselves and the world, so we don't recognize sometimes when we're downward spiraling. So we all probably have experienced trauma. Unconsciously, I think what we do is we try to normalize or rationalize our experiences to not experience suffering, but at times that also causes us to do harm to ourselves and other people. We need to protect our worldviews, but also sometimes our worldviews are what causes negative aspects in our lives because we can't comprehend that we're being a bad person. Addiction Recovery asks, but so does Jodo Shinshu. Oh, and I will probably say Shin Buddhism or just Shin from now on, just for time. I think both ask for us to have some responsibility for our actions. I argue when we have been wrong, we should both ask for us to see our side first and then recognize what the other people are doing to us. But we have to keep our side of the street clean. That's what they taught us in the recovery program. So, I am not doing my slides. These are the hungry ghosts. I'll come back to this a little bit later, but basically Amida Buddha's on the right side of the screen, and there's hungry ghosts. It's a realm of existence in Buddhism. They're modern, in the modern view, they're just viewed as like a metaphor for craving. So the ones in front of Amida are asking for spiritual nourishment. The ones in the fire on the bottom left, they're trying to eat water, but it's turning into fire. These are the, sorry, I don't know what happened. This is supposed to be the evil person, Akunin or evil person, and this is the object of liberation. Just for some fun, before this gets really heavy, I'm a Star Wars nerd. I believe that Anakin on the left side of the screen, he becomes Darth Vader, and I think he's the hero of Star Wars in a Jodo Shinshu lens. He tried to be good. His ego and his greed kind of grows and his attachments grows, and over time he becomes Darth Vader, a really bad person. But he was also being manipulated by the guy on the left, the Emperor. And I'll get back to that later, but I think the Emperor could maybe represent our outside circumstances. Like, we are who we are, but we've also been influenced by so many things. Part of that is why we do things the way we do. I see the dark side in Star Wars, or the Sith, or Darth Vader, kind of being like a hungry ghost. They're representing addictive behaviors, egos, and I think we all display aspects of this. Some of us, obviously more than others. I think we have to also remember that there's not just this idea, there's a stereotypical idea of you're addicted to X. We can not be addicted to anything, but still display addict behaviors, and I'll go into that a little bit later. Addicts always want more. So Darth Vader, now he's in his bad guy uniform, he's doing his force choke. I thought that represents grasping, the need to always be right. Hungry ghosts are never fulfilled. They never have enough, just like addicts. I appreciate how Vader is always searching, needing, proving that he should be the victor. And then if you know Star Wars, you know what happens at the end, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So back to the hungry ghosts. We talked about the ghosts are trying to drink water on the bottom left side of the screen, but it's turning into fire. So their suffering is constant, never ends. I think this relates to the idea that addicts never really make it, which was taught in rehab. If you're an addict, you can get by and fake it, but there's still problems in your life. You just maybe aren't aware of it, but I think other people will be affected by it. Something that we learned in the drug rehab is, I'm sure some of you have heard this, what's the definition of insanity, right? Maybe not. Okay. So the idea is the definition of insanity is an addict. You do the same thing over and over and over and over, and you don't understand why nothing changes. You expect different results, but how will that happen if you do the same actions over and over? I think we've been socialized to not be the bad person in our minds. I think we use this idea of addict behaviors to trick ourselves into thinking, I can sustain this. But if we never realize this, we're never going to change. Most likely things are just going to get worse. I think from a religious standpoint, whether it's Buddhism or a 12-step program or anything, once we're sustained, specifically for us, the Buddhist teachings, that's where spiritual expression and gratitude can be profound. This is represented in where the ghosts are receiving the teachings from Amida on the right-hand side, and then they're drinking nourishment like enlightenment, and I assume they're leaving this realm going to the Pure Land. So something has to change. We have to have a shift in perspective in Jodo Shinshu. How do we get there? Perhaps an encounter with a person, listening to the teachings, having a conversation with a close friend or minister. I think George Lucas purposely put in aspects of Jodo Shinshu into his mythical universe world building. For Darth Vader, if you've seen the movie, Vader becomes the worst person. He kills children that are supposed to be trained to be Jedis, right? But in the end, after however many years of him being a bad person, he meets his son, and through that interaction, he sacrifices himself at the end of the movie, or the first trilogy. And without the special Jedi training, or Buddhist training, like the former Jedi, he still goes to the Force, becomes one with it, and is able to come back again without any special training to guide Luke and other Jedi. I think this is representative of Amida's other power, the Force, and then Shin Buddhists, maybe the old Jedis are like a different form of Buddhists, and Darth Vader and these Force ghosts are Shin Buddhists. They go to the Pure Land or the Force and then come back to guide other people as Bodhisattvas do in our religion. So these are the Force ghosts. Anakin Skywalker is the older gentleman on the right. I think we all know Yoda. Yoda and the guy on the left, Obi-Wan Kenobi, did the training, but Anakin didn't. And I think that's representative. All beings get to go to the Pure Land because I know George Lucas understood Jodo Shinshu. And that's just kind of fun because this is going to be a heavy day. But if you need to kind of play with that, I hope the visual representation helps. No? Sorry, I don't know what that was. So Shinran Shonin, this is our founder. He felt he was not good. So I hoped to approach a 12-step program by utilizing Master Shinran's approach to Jodo Shinshu, hereby after Shin Buddhism. Through points of contact, I believe the hungry ghosts that represent ceaseless craving with Shinran's understanding of Buddhism added a new perspective as a minister and how maybe for us as ministers or lay people, we can form doctrinal understandings of Shin Buddhism and implant it or supplement it into a recovery model. I talked about the hungry ghosts. So Amida Buddha Center, the Bodhisattvas on the left and right, they have light coming from them. I think that's supposed to represent compassion for us in more of a real working world, maybe the teachings. Shinran thought he was incapable of being good, understanding his own imperfections, mirrored with tons and tons of self-reflection, created a shift in perspective for him. And I think through the other power of Amida, he was transformed over time in his life. He writes a lot about his ego as a cause of suffering. And I think in addiction, we know that addiction is caused by the ego, and that hinders recovery. So this is another Star Wars thing. It's Yoda following the light of a former Jedi. Shin Buddhism shows us how to understand decisions, our decisions based on greed, anger, and ignorance. That causes us to be trapped in the mindset of hungry ghosts. I think in a roundabout way in Jodo Shinshu, it's not prescriptive, but from the back end in, we do learn how to address these issues. Through an interpretation of the Tani Show, I wanted to try to find a point of contact between the Tani Show writing and the 12-step program, and that's how my thesis came to be. I wrote about Tani Shows and the Akunin a lot, the evil person in school, and for a advanced pastoral care class, we had to write about a projected thesis. And so I wrote about self-reflection and Tani Show and drug addiction for a pastoral care project, and that's kind of how this starts to go. In another chaplaincy class, we were supposed to use our own faiths. There was other religious people to talk about our trauma in our lives, and someone instead of doing the religion through Quakerism, and I was interested because, Quaker oats, that's what I think about Quakers. I know that's kind of messed up, but I was like, we'll hear about this guy's religion, and then he told Sensei, he didn't tell us, that he wanted to use a 12-step program to reflect on spirituality. And so all these things kind of implanted in my brain over time, and that's how we got to here. I had to look at a bunch of different Buddhist authors who have Buddhist programs, not from Jodo Shinshu, obviously, and other medical Buddhist people who wrote about recovery. It's more of it was like a case study. He talked about his clients. I wanted to use cultural competency for my cultural anthropology background. And I guess to point out to that, I think how we were trained in anthropology kind of is on the opposite side of what we are supposed to see the world as in theology. I actually don't really like the humanities. I feel like it's too binary or black and white. I think in cultural anthropology, the point was to find how maybe one of you and I have a different culture, a way of seeing the world. I have to respect the differences that you see the world in, and also understand then that if I'm talking to you and you have a different culture, I may need to explain things differently. I think what we're trying to do here is bring two separate worlds together, something based out of Christian Protestant language and maybe even Western psychology with Eastern philosophy, which is Buddhism. I try to use myself in my writings and in my Dharma talks as the teaching moment, not because I'm a good person, but I hope in sharing my experience, someone can use me as the bad person. Like, oh, Landon did this, he's the wrong person, he's the bad person, but then get something out of that message and maybe later be like, oh, maybe do I do that too? I think it's safer for a practitioner, and especially someone in recovery, to sometimes be like, we still have to point outside, it's the other. Landon's the other, he's the bad person. I think through recovery in Buddhism or religion overall, we can have a shift in perspective leading back to the force or Amida Buddha's other power, the compassion that gives us enlightenment. We need the light in our lives. Our egos is what stops us from interacting with compassion and Amida's vow. I think we need to do a deep dive into our own accountability and be transparent with ourselves. I think the biggest thing is not religion in this process. Everyone's like, well, if you're priest, Buddhism, Jodo Shinshu would be the most important thing, and I don't agree with that. I think we need to address the suffering of people first, where they're from. Later, we can implant more Shin doctrine. We're dealing with mental health spectrums of all types of religious influences, cultures, and trauma. So I personally would think that if I was going to do something like this, it would need to be gently, or people will just leave. We all need having insights into addict behaviors. All of us suffer from it. Even non-addicts get benefit in this research. This type of self-reflection helps us see our own blind spots, and hopefully in a safer approach in regard to mental health. I think if I had to summarize this on one point, emotional awareness would be the most important thing in recovery. It's important for religious life, but also for addiction recovery. I don't think any one of these Buddhist programs that we're going to talk about is better than the other. I think what we could do is supplement Jodo Shinshu into these things. People have been running from the trauma. Everyone does. I might seem critical of various viewpoints from some of the authors. I try to perform at a higher level of academia, but I think people's worldviews need to be considered as your truths, and I think we need to adjust and bring it down and be more flexible with how we approach people's own opinions, because again, we want them to stay. We want them to stay in recovery. We hopefully want them to stay in our religion. I think we have to let some of their ideas stand true, even if we don't personally feel it ourselves. People need to be open to letting this sink in. Even if you reject this initially, please just consider one aspect of it. It could provide new or different perspectives that maybe will play out later in life. Shouldn't we all want the same goals, recovery from addiction or deepening faith through religion? I think this research shows that those who want can find a way to alleviate suffering, but it's not an easy job. Oops. Oh, I have skipped ahead in my slides somehow. In chapter 1, I talked about step 1. We admitted we're powerless. So I looked at two authors, Kevin Griffin and Joni K. Rose. They kind of used the first step to fit their Buddhist traditions through the Four Noble Truths. So when I was working in rehab, they would always tell the youth, you made the choice to do drugs. This is your fault. You're here because of your choices. You have to choose to live differently. When I went back to the temple to try to help figure out how to not use marijuana, what changed for me was I'd only read about Shin Buddhism. I hadn't really gone back to church, but to live in it was different than just reading about it. At the time, I thought if I spent enough time at temple, Landon, could make myself not be bad. After years of trying to be good and failing, I would suppress my anger, and then it would overflow, and sometimes at the not correct moments, and I would get in trouble for that. Kohara Sensei, some of you may know, I asked him once about Shinjin. We translate it as entrustment in Amida Buddha as other power or compassion. I grew up in college thinking it was faith. I prefer faith just because that feels something. Entrustment is kind of just a word. Kohara Sensei said, the way you're describing yourself, you're trying to make yourself be good, and that's self-power. We don't really do that in Jodo Shinshu. You have to let go. And that confused me. How can I be transformed? I'm not the one doing the action. Today, I see myself as powerless, and that language is embedded into addiction recovery. Ironically, years and years later, we had the same conversation, and he said, you won't know necessarily when you start to experience changing, it'll just be there. And I was like, well, how do I know? When is the shift of faith supposed to happen? And so for the context of this, the story is alcoholic beverages, but I'll say coffee. So he said, when you're drinking coffee, how do you know when you've had enough coffee? And I was like, the second, third cup. And he's like, no, the infinite, finite moment that you went from not being on coffee to being fully caffeinated. And I was like, well, I don't know sometimes when I stand up, because you don't know. And that's what Shinjin's kind of like. Your faith, your entrustment grows over time. You're in a period where you don't know that it's happening, but because you keep coming back, it's going to keep growing. I think Jodo Shinshu asks us to recognize our inability to do good. Westerners like to hold on to the idea that we are good, or I, Landon, can be good on my own. That's okay to think that. It's a different religious perspective, but if we buy into that idea that I have all the power, then I think it's hard to appreciate what Jodo Shinshu really has to offer. So Kevin Griffin's One Breath at a Time, he's a local person, he's from Berkeley. Blaine Higa told me, hey, there's this training being done on Zoom. You should join it. It'd be good for your thesis. So he did a month-long training on his book, One Breath at a Time. I used his work a lot just because I attended a lecture for a month on how someone could run his drug program. I pulled from other scholars and philosophers to kind of talk about Shin perspectives on like powerlessness, karma, dependent co-arising. The idea is like karma and dependent co-arising. Nothing exists in a void. Every single interaction, big and small, all kind of plays into how we see the world. And then I think that leads into free will. Do we have a choice to choose? Or is it dependent co-arising that just it's our situations that teach us, what we think we're supposed to do? Shin Buddhist teachings, particularly that we are akunin, or a person who does karmic evil, I think that can help in recovery programs. People can acknowledge their faults, embracing their powerlessness, while not forcing guilt or shame, but hopefully empowers them to view themselves as through Amida's eyes with wisdom and compassion, to be kind and gentle to our past mistakes. So step 1. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol and that our lives had become unmanageable. Has everyone's kind of heard this, or maybe not? Does anyone here want to admit complete defeat? Admission of powerless is the first step in liberation, according to Kevin Griffin. Relation of humility to sobriety, mental obsession plus physical allergy. Why do addicts have to hit rock bottom? Griffin talks about steps 1 through 3 as surrender steps. Surrendering to the reality that someone is suffering from a disease, but also to a higher power. For us, we would say other power, Amida Buddha. But you must rely on a power outside of yourselves to get sober and to grow so you can choose to learn differently. My choice was being told you should go back to temple. But again, to hear Shin Buddhism live and interact in a community and its lived religious culture versus just reading and theorizing about it. Again, I thought that Landon could make himself not be bad, but I kept slipping. I would suppress my anger and it would overflow at not opportune times. And I was like, well, something has to change. This isn't working as much as I thought it could do. Oh, I'm getting mixed up. If you know someone who's struggled with addiction, if you've seen them at their worst, you know the addiction has crippled them. Kevin Griffin says surrendering becomes preferable to fighting, but sometimes it takes a long time to get to that point. He says one works the steps, endeavors, and work is involved. The first step is quitting the addiction and admitting that you have a problem. He said even at that, sometimes a new sense of awareness helps someone begin to see themselves in their situation through an honest perspective versus the addicts like manipulating and purposely looking the other way or unconsciously looking the other way. He uses right view as a Buddhist alternative, referencing the Eightfold Noble Path. He says this is the Buddhist blueprint for spiritual development. He says right view allows you to see the truth of suffering, but also those around you, and that leads to the vision of possible freedom. The second book that I looked at, Joni K. Rose, sold at BCA bookstore if you want a drug addiction Buddhist recovery book. She reformulates step 1 is, we admit that identified with our egotistical selves, being powerless over our own human weakness, at times we cannot manage our own lives. Joni talks about that we all think that we're all powerful, but points to steps 1 teaching, saying technically we're powerless over everything. She also references things that I had never heard of. First, Codependence Anonymous, and that helps people admit that they're powerless over people. And then Emotions Anonymous, which is that we're not in control of our emotions, that we don't have the ability to control that. She says this is true for most, but most of us can't admit this to ourselves. She says if you've ever lived through abuse, worst is if it happened to you in childhood. She says it's harder to admit that you have these problems because it's, again, you're putting up a wall to not deal with your trauma, which is reasonable. But she also warns Buddhists to not boast or rejoice over this fact. She uses the word we instead of I, as only we can share in the company of others who've experienced similar things as we have, and this is in regards to addiction recovery. I believe all includes anyone who's lived through trauma, and the reason that we have trauma and then have negative aspects of it is we wall it off. We don't want to think about it because it's painful. Rose uses the first noble truth to show that they're suffering, and the first step creates an understanding on how to stop denying our powerlessness, which leads to radical transformations inside of us. Griffin says that no one wants to surrender, but as an addict, he admitted at some point that the addiction had crippled him. He said that I keep doing this, sorry. I don't have these written, I'm just flipping it back. What Rose was talking about is the change for Shin Buddhists. When we wholeheartedly understand the need for Amita's vow, that we're transformed through the Buddhist teachings and Amita's light and compassion, the powerless that we might face, it is the inability to do good, but also, if we can start at a very low baseline, you can also only go up. Rose notes that the Buddha talked about the egotistical self or soul as an illusion. She writes, when you're looking inside yourself, you find that you're basically empty. Then it's easy to understand that you are powerless. She informs that the root of addiction is due to the false belief in our all-powerful egotistical self that pretends like it's in control. She ends the section by writing, we base our lives on this idea of personal power, but it's not actually there. But that leads us to unmanageable lives. When we can admit we're not in control, the question then becomes, if we're not in control, who is? In Shin Buddhism, if the idea of self is strong, then we're not able to do away with it. But we can be transformed, but then what's necessary for that process to start happening? So working at the rehab, I went back at the temple, and here's where Shin Buddhism grows in my heart and my appreciation. The lived religious experience worked well with the theory of addiction recovery. I think had that not happened, I'd be a very different person in life, in a really bad way. I'm not saying that I'm good, but I have a lot of problems, obviously, we all do, but I'd be way worse off if I hadn't gone back to temple. I think we can appreciate the need for wanting everything now. Griffin talks about how addicts push for instant gratification. I think we can appreciate that, right? But how do you unlearn that? So he writes, meditation formalizes the patient in one breath at a time. And it's the name of his book and his recovery program. For Buddhists, he says this non-reactivity is considered mindfulness. We've all probably heard of mindfulness. The first step in Buddhist meditation for him is to feel the present moment without commentary and fear. If anyone here has ever tried to meditate for 15, 20, 50 minutes, an hour, your head can go to kind of a dark place, which I don't recommend doing. You should start meditating in smaller spurts. He says that when people realize they can't control their mind, and he says addicts are impatient, self-critical, and wanting to be perfectionists, he teaches, please don't try to control your thoughts. Rather, change the relationship using right intention. In our orthodox Jodo Shinshu, Shin Buddhism says that we cannot change our minds either. Other power transforms us beyond the capability of our own efforts. How addicts think relates to issues found in Jodo Shinshu. Concepts like the Akunin, other power, Shinjin, or entrustment are powerful worldviews found in our religion. Obviously, Griffin is not Jodo Shinshu. But doing his guided meditations, I think I understand why this meditation is effective. I think even, maybe a little heresy here, that his meditation guided retreats are probably more in line with what the average person, average Buddhist, average Jodo Shinshu member person needs. It gives you something to do, but of course he's trained in this, it's his program. I think if we attempted to do what Griffin has done, we would need our own plan, of course, of action on how to guide people in sessions, and I believe Nikon therapy would suffice, and Nikon therapy, if you don't know, is therapy based on core principles of Jodo Shinshu. It's kind of considered not religion anymore by the people in Japan, but I think it is. And I'll try to talk about that a little bit later, and Carmela Sensei is you have someone trained in Nikon, so I won't waste your time talking about it too much because she'll get into it. So Griffin talks about the Four Noble Truths, or the core of all Buddhist teachings from the Buddha. It's his first talk. Encapsulating difficulties in life, their cause and solution, directly relating to issues addicts face. Step one, again, admitting powerlessness and manageability of our lives. He sees it as the first noble truth, or dukkha, suffering. When one sees clearly, not shying away from pain, not denying it, but understanding this is suffering, he says that's when your journey can begin. A long time ago, when I was maybe playing with the idea of coming to IBS, some of you might know Reverend Matt Hamasaki, we were having a discussion, and he was teaching me what he learned at IBS. I was teaching him what I learned from doing recovery programs, addiction programs, mental health treatment, just so he could learn how to work with people from what I learned, and then he could teach me about Shin Buddhism. So he taught me the phrase, the more the ice, the more the water. Has anyone heard that phrase before? Okay. Basically, it means our blind passions or the ice melt away into Shinjin or trust or faith or enlightenment. So at that point in my life, I appreciated having blind passions. I didn't understand, how does that faith make me deserving of Amita's gift of enlightenment? And that, I struggled with that. I kind of would go to dark places when I would think about it by myself. And so I asked ministers over and over, what did this mean? Teach me, like make me understand this. About a year later, Hamasaki Sensei, and I met up, and he asked about my relationship with my father, which had never really been good. At the time, it was like 20 years ago, I think, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Things weren't great, but better than they had been in the past 20 years. Hamasaki Sensei, however, was confused that I wasn't getting more angry about discussing this relationship. I mean, we might have been having some adult sodas too. So I explained, me and my dad are never going to see eye to eye. I'm never going to do what my dad wants me to do. And I used to get really upset about it. In fact, I used to get so mad that I became an angry person. I used to be very calm and timid. Didn't talk a lot. No one believes me, but that's how I was as a kid. But in, taking a step back, I knew my grandfather was harming my dad. At that point in my life, I could appreciate the causes and conditions my family had kind of put us in. My great-grandfather passed when my grandfather was a child. So I think it was like 10 or 11, my grandfather had to basically take over the family farm and be the main person to feed the family. He didn't get to have a childhood. Nor could he ask his father questions as he grew up. How do you do business? How do you, I don't like to say this, but like be a man. This was my karma. This was our karma. My dad's style of rearing made me angry. I rebelled. I wanted to be independent. So I go down kind of a bad path. Luckily, a condition of my life, working in a rehab, pushed me to go back to temple so I could learn about Jodo Shinshu, and I could try to appreciate how higher power and other power could be merged together. That was a really hard 9 months. I couldn't use weed to self-medicate, but being sober, I started realizing, I've made a lot of really bad decisions in my life. I've hurt a lot of people. The only problem was I didn't understand the idea of evil in Jodo Shinshu yet. I thought I was so bad that I shouldn't open up to a minister because the minister would judge me. Like, how could you do those things? How could you be that bad? That wouldn't have been the case for most ministers, but that took me like a decade to kind of understand that. We can't escape our past. The steps in Buddhism ask us to navigate just our parts to play and push us to hopefully have a little bit more emotional awareness. Has my ice melted enough in the water? Is this statement even true? I think about it. I know as a priest you shouldn't, but I doubt our religion sometimes. I think that's normal. I do take solace in, here's another Star Wars thing. This is the way. I tried to be good. It could only last for so long. Something would set me off, and I would go into a rage where I wanted to fight, I wanted to hurt people, or at least I would think bad things about people, if not actually saying it. Griffin says we must engage in the truth skillfully before we can let go of any kind of suffering. Doing so means directly seeing it in all forms, similar how he said we need to admit to our disease before the process of recovery can begin. For Shin Buddhism, the ice melting only comes once one appreciates the need of being enlightened given to us. We can theoretically state what our religion says, but to live within that type of worldview is extremely difficult, maybe kind of impossible, and yet it's so prolific. I think we've been socialized to stray away from this type of reflection, but don't we all kind of need to do that, addicts or not? Rose defines the first noble truth as, are we allowed to swear? I'm quoting this, life is a bitch and then you die. That's her first noble truth. I liked it. I hope that's okay that I share that with you. She points Murphy's Law. Anything that can go wrong is going to go wrong when you don't need it to go wrong, like doing this workshop. I decided to make a slideshow, and my wife is like, you can't have the slideshow on your computer and your notes. You're going to have to put it in like the notes section in this, but I had too many notes, or you have to print it. But we spent an hour trying to make it work. Of course, Thursday night at like 3:30 in the morning, maybe I should have already had this done. But here we are. Rose also talks about some religions and philosophies teach the universe is actually perfect. And suffering is either unnecessary or an illusion, but the Buddha taught suffering happens to everyone. She explains dukkha as disjointed pain, unpleasantness, or lack of satisfaction. So she says instead of medicating or using drugs or your addiction, she says live with the suffering, try to embrace it. She quotes Thich Nhat Hanh suggesting one should say hello to their suffering, to nurture it as a crying baby. Don't run for it, rather understand what causes your suffering. This is important for addicts, but I think this is Buddhist too. Rose states, it's one's unwillingness to confront suffering that leads to addict behaviors. So the second noble truth, Griffin says this is the Buddha seeing that there's inherent unsatisfactoriness in life. So you should explore where it comes from. The Buddha found ceaseless desire for pleasure and self-centered gratification, hence the need for Buddhism. So the Buddha also says what the appropriate response is to stop following every impulse and develop restraint around cravings. Easier said than done, right? So I think this is where addicts can relate to Buddhism. One is powerless over their desires, and yet their effort to satisfy these desires, what happens? You kind of want it more. When you become self-aware of this aspect, hopefully you can start to appreciate the steps and Buddhism, one or the other, or both. In Shin Buddhism, Shinran's writings, this is a hymn or a poem, sometimes we chant as the English translation, ignorance and blind passions abound, pervading everywhere like immutable particles of dust. Desire and hatred arising out of conflict and accord are like high peaks and mountain ridges. So I see Shinran talking about addict behaviors. I think even non-addicts by societal standards do all of this. Could we all benefit from being more emotionally aware and reflect more? I think so. Why do all people want to escape or numb their feelings? We do this all the time, and it's easier for us to project like, I'm not the problem, you guys, or all you people are the problem. Maybe displace, you're trying to tell me that I'm doing something wrong and I bring up something else that's not related. These are like addict behaviors, manipulation, to kind of move away from dealing with the addiction or perhaps the trauma or both. For Jodo Shinshu people, this would require all of us to, in this kind of program, to kind of do a deep dive into what makes you you, and that's hard to do. Rose defines the second noble truth as, if you think you have it, then it really has you. She says, as Americans, this is hard to appreciate. We can see from an outward glance that suffering exists, and yet we can't really, as Americans, look into what is the cause of this suffering. She believes by bringing suffering onto ourselves through our desires, it just leads to more suffering. But when we do that kind of thing, we're suffering, we're also hurting the other people around us. She says that society actually encourages this idea in terms of like working, getting ahead. You screw other people over to make the bottom line or to make money. I think a lot of us are guilty of doing this. Important to note, Rose brings this up, it happens in other places too, that it's not just addiction to substances. There's addictions to sex, gambling, violence, TV, luxury items. She notes obsessive compulsive behaviors and warns that these sometimes are just as dangerous, if not more so, than substance abuse. She talks about process of addiction can be regarded as psychological versus chemical, but reminds us if you're in a substance abuse thing, then you may have both. Even gambling and sexual addictions to chemicals created to make the addict crave wanting more of it are the same hormones that our bodies produce, but we get that from doing other things, but obviously our addictions give us more. She brings up this word tanha, I know I'm not probably saying it right, or thirst. Obvious for alcoholics, but it's also translated as desire. So like the idea of grasping, self-centered wanting. What happens with attachment is also an object of desire. She notes craving, clinging, attachment, compulsion, and addiction could be other translations of this. She writes how the Buddha taught ignorance lies at the root of this issue. In Buddhism, this does not create only suffering now, leading to death, but in your rebirth, it caused bad future lives you'll be suffering as well. She talks about the 12 links in the chain of suffering and describes the Buddhist practices of dependent origination, and she notes that it's hard to perceive the predicted effect on our future rebirths. If we look carefully, we can see the results of our actions and feelings within the present lifespan, not worrying about future lives. I think Carmela is going to talk about this too, so I might just skip this section. ambition for Rose is important, and she said ambition is more subtle than craving. It's only when the desire becomes all-consuming, leading to issues. And then she writes about Devadatta, the Buddhist cousin, who's destroyed by his own ambitions. In Shin Buddhism, he's a key player of the Nirvana story. I think the Nirvana story is a teaching lesson for all of us. Maybe we should strive to understand that maybe we're kind of like Devadatta, the bad person of the story. If we are like him, are we still able to receive compassion from the Buddha? Because Devadatta is still considered a bodhisattva or like a saint, depending on what sect of Buddhism you're in. He had to be the evil person to go to hell, to be a lesson for all of us to learn something from it. Our ambitions downplay us. Our ambitions drive us to downplay our faults. Our egos are driving us to miss our blind spots. We only focus on our selfish goals, which harms others in a quest for status. Obviously, Devadatta is the manipulator in the story, pushing Ajatasattu, a prince, to do harmful acts to his parents, basically imprisoning his dad, imprisoning the mom when the Queen Vaidehi was giving the king food and water, and then he executes his dad so the mom can't do that anymore. Are we Ajatasattu? Are we the person being influenced by outside actions, maybe Devadatta in a metaphor? And are we building up our egos so we can believe we are true and good? This Buddhist story is supposed to teach us even the worst of us are still embraced. So in line with Buddhism and addiction recovery, maybe we need to see ourselves as the bad characters of the story, not the victims of the story. Tanha can also be used as hate. Again, Darth Vader. But also Devadatta and Asatru. These are the bad people in the Western context of religion. They're the enemies. We shouldn't try to be like them if we grew up in America. But I think Darth Vader is the hero of Star Wars because he is the evil person that at the end of his life has a turn of perspective and gains perfect liberation. I think storytelling is important for learning, but also for self-exploration of viewing oneself inward. That's why I like to use myself as an example for the story aspect. The person doesn't have to be, I'm not prescriptive. I'm not telling all of you or the people, you're the bad person. I'm using myself as the example to hope that something starts to, like a seed starts to get planted and they'll grow maybe tomorrow, maybe in 10 years. Working with high-risk clients, but have found with friends too, most of the time when we try to get someone to do something, they shut down or worse and go on the attack because no one wants to look at themselves. I argue there's a strong point of contact between addicts manipulating and non-addicts doing anything to not have it, to take that deep look, I'm going to use a Christian word, moral inventory for a lack of better terms. We all see the faults of others, right? Our subconscious knows we do it too, but instead of looking in and being like, maybe you're part of the problem, of course, all of you are the problem. I'm fine. It's your fault that I'm suffering or I'm an addict or doing bad things. When we have to look at ourselves, this begins to break our sense of self. Our fragile perceptions of how the world works get shattered, and you do go to a bad place. We put up a mental wall to kind of avoid this, but I think if we're going to be working in addiction or in Jodo Shinshu or religion in general, we do kind of have to experience that to need the outside help. I don't care if it's God, Amida Buddha, a higher power, whatever it is, because we can't do everything all alone. But as an addict, you kind of think that you have control of everything and you don't need anyone else's help. If this work was easy, we would all be sober and perfect people, but it's not. I actually think most people don't have the toolboxes, they haven't been socialized to do this kind of deep dive. At least for Jodo Shinshu Buddhist, we can hopefully fall back on Shinron's own words, who admits his struggles and then talks about why entrusting and insurance in the Pure Land is given is so important to him. In the Tani show, granted the practitioner has to have some emotional awareness and confidence in the teacher to get to this place, there can be a change of perspective. But how many people, if we're all Jodo Shinshu or your Jodo Shinshu, admit that they are the foolish being, the Bombu person, or the Akunin, the evil person? Do they actually practice reflecting on this? Do any of us fully believe and think that this Shin Buddhist theology is made for the worst of the worst, and we're supposed to potentially be those people? You can say that. I can write a book about it. I'm going to try to write a book about this. But that doesn't mean that I'm actually doing it in my personal life. We can talk the talk, but can we walk the walk? Again, wanting to note that Nikon therapy could be beneficial for people, even in its secular form outside of Amita's compassion. I don't think it should be, and it's not, but that's kind of the doctrinal thing, is Nikon can't be considered part of Jodo Shinshu because it's not as focused on Amida Buddha. But I think as Westerners, maybe we can appreciate this, Westerners need prescriptive practices. We've been socialized to A, think through a Christian lens. We speak English. If you speak English, you've been influenced by Christian worldviews. The Western value systems teach us to believe in yourself. Landon, if you do good, you can go to college, you can get a good job, you can have a house and do all this on your own. Not technically true. But we're taught through our own work, independent and vigor, we can be the hero of the story. Very opposite of what happens in Japanese cultural systems, where people are asked to think about the greater good, the group. Perhaps for Japanese people in Japan, it's a little bit easier to rely on the idea of the other because you're already always thinking about the out instead of the individual. The third noble truth is described where the Buddha is discussing desire ends, suffering ends, and when we let go of craving, the pain dissolves. Oh, did I skip? Did I do it again? I'm sorry. These aren't numbered. I apologize. For Jodo Shinshu people, Amida Buddhist power is supposed to be all we need. It's supposed to sustain us as the practitioners. That leads us to having a shift in perspective. If liberation at the end of life is enough to sustain our needs in our daily lives today, I think that's when the ice starts to melt. Our blind passions, our cravings, what makes us not good people gets slowly turned into water, which is like compassion, enlightenment. I think this is the safest place to start for Jodo Shinshu people to dig in who they are and why they are. And for that reason, the Buddha wants to liberate you and give you enlightenment. The merit transference has already happened. We just don't understand that yet. But we're supposed to all be going to the Pure Land. So if so, then it doesn't matter what the worst of your life is, because the Amida Buddha is still giving you compassion. This is a good place to start. Uncovering one's dark side. It's because of the dark side, the light shines even more. Shandao's Yishijishin, twofold deep mind is important here because a deep mind that entrusts due to the realization that we are not good, and then understanding why Amita's 48 vows, in fact, are for us and are true. The third step Rose talks about, there's an identifying the possibility of nirvana. Nirvana is the joy of being where you are and loving just as what here and now has to offer. She's observed our suffering is caused by our cravings and the attachments we create to these things. So she argues, just let it go. Easier said than done. She says that addictive nature is encouraged by popular media, making it difficult, especially this book was written like 20 years ago. Social media wasn't a thing now. It's even harder to get to these kind of life lessons. But she teaches one can still find happiness in striving to fulfill one's cravings. I think the idea of happiness is a problem. From my look on Jodo Shinshu, perhaps as Buddhists we should use the terms settled or content. The idea is happiness, or the idea of finding happiness in the spectrum is a lot closer to issues surrounding cravings and attachments discussed by Rose. I think there's also a problem that we would need to address in the use of Christian language in terms versus Buddhist ones, like shinjin or entrustment used to be translated as faith. I like faith because if we had a soul, in my inner being, faith means something. I feel something when we talk about faith. If you say entrust, it's kind of like, well, I trust that this mic's going to work, but I don't know if it's actually going to do it. I also think then because of that, we need to be very careful with the language we use when we're working with people in recovery, because we, as priests, don't necessarily know what the person views in terms of worldview. They might need the Christian language and the Christian worldview, but over time, if you're flexible with them, then you can impose more stuff on Jodo Shinshu. We all say, what makes us happy? But this is something we're just chasing. I like my cigarettes. I already had 2 today, maybe 3. Shouldn't smoke cigarettes, but that makes me happy. My wife likes jewelry. She wants me to always buy her jewelry. Can we ever be content? Would 1 cigarette have been enough before this thing? Probably, but I wanted 2. Does she need like 5 boxes of jewelry? Maybe, or maybe she could be content with 1. I think when people's perspectives change, then they can appreciate what they actually have rather than feeling it's never enough. Again, to remind everyone, we're gifted liberation from Amida. So cultural and societal issues that I see in this kind of work is our egos are the focus of I as an individual, then it's hard to see our part. Self-serving needs need to be addressed. Again, remember, we're given the gift of enlightenment. We have to recognize this. But to live our lives from this perspective means we must monitor how much we're taking from wherever, whoever, than what we're actually receiving. Again, Nikon will come up later. This needs to be addressed from recovery, but as well as Shin practitioners. So I'd like to ask everyone in the audience, if you're given enlightenment, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do with it? Will you only worry about yourself, or will you give something to those around you who need more help than you? And there's not a right or wrong answer. This is just something to reflect on. I'm going to skip ahead. How much time do I have, Sensei?
As much as you want.
What time is it?
You can go about another 10, 20 minutes.
Oh, we're going to skip ahead. Okay, the fourth noble truth. Sorry. There's a way to end suffering, the Eightfold Noble Path. Reverend says here, the Buddha tells us how to live and attain freedom. This teaches letting go by cultivating our hearts and minds. I had read Bishop Matsumoto from Hawaii quoting Reverend Henry Adams saying the Mahayana, kind of an overhead Buddhist grouping of what we fall into as Jodo Shinshus, talks about focusing on benefiting others as a goal of practice. Again, this is not something that addicts want to do. They only want to look at themselves. The six Paramitas provide an alternative model of the Eightfold Noble Path as the essential elements of Mahayana Buddhism. They carry the exact same virtues while implying benefit to others, starting with generosity and dana. Most addicts don't appreciate or practice dana or generosity. The end, it ends with wisdom, implying benefits. And gaining wisdom comes from practice of benefiting others. As we aspire for enlightenment, but not doing the work ourselves, the Bodhisattva path embarks on two ideologies, non-egocentricity and the benefiting of the self, but also those around you. I think this is what I was talking about when I said something happened to Shin Buddhism, the shift of perspective. However, because Jodo Shinshu Buddhists don't do the work, it's a reverse process. So rather than the I doing something, we're transformed by Amita's other power or compassionate vow. Realistically, we're all on some spectrum between Shin Buddhism and Christian upbringings, and that's why doing something like this would be difficult to do. Griffin talks about the purifying stage of spiritual development is sila, meaning morality or virtue. One lives an ethical life, and Griffin notes that the fifth lay precept is to abstain from intoxicants, and that leads to heedlessness. In his experiences practicing Buddhism, and this was probably like in the 60s and 70s, he said most teachers skipped this aspect because everyone was doing drugs and they didn't want people to not come into the Buddhist stuff because they told them, well, you can't do LSD and smoke marijuana. But he says it's really important today because if you talk about this, the purifying aspects of it are more than what sobriety gives. It shows what was hidden. So you're holding a lamp up to the dark, uncovering repressed aspects of the psyche. Even before he was sober, the Dharma was working to uncover hidden things. It just took him a very long time for his inner goal, this is a different type of Buddhist practice, to shine more brightly. He says today, the dross of his instructor behaviors stand out so much more to him. He's also been sober for a really long time. For Jodo Shinshu, the process of coming to terms is flipped. If we understand our true authentic selves as imperfect or evil, again, thanks to the life of Amida Buddha, in theory, this would make us entrust. Instead of us being good or light coming out of us, the darkness inside of us is shown because the light is coming at us and showing us our bad parts. But I think this can lead to healing. We're going to skip ahead to more Buddhist stuff. So hungry ghosts. Oops. So again, the hungry ghosts and addict behavior. The idea of the ghosts comes from like older forms of Buddhism. The hunger part was added later, but it's supposed to represent the bad conditions that people are living in. The ghosts, if they do get food, try to put something up to their lips and their mouths kind of close shut, or the water turns into fire, or gross things like pus and scum. And maybe they can eat that, but a lot of times they can't. So they're always looking for food and drink, and when they find it, they encounter obstacles. Is that not any different than a drug addict? In this really good book, if you've ever heard of Gabor Mate, I might be saying his name wrong, in the realm of Hungry Ghost, he talks about his Buddhist view on addiction through case studies with his clients, but also coming to terms with his own addictive behaviors and traits. He said that the Buddha identifies addictions as delusions as we create to be happy versus content. So again, content comes up. He also talks about that some addictions society says are more acceptable, if not preferable, like overworking. Mate says an overworker is not any different than an addict. They do not spend a lot of time with their family. So again, I want to remind everyone that, of course, drug addiction is really dangerous and bad, but there's other forms of addictions. Mate warns us or states that addictions are not distinct disorders, but rather manifestations, underlying processes expressed through a variety of ways, such as neurological and psychological malfunctions. Mate also says that the hardcore hungry ghost, the worst of the craving, you can also be in a good place because you have nothing left to lose and you don't care about anything else. I think if we as Shin Buddhists truly see ourselves as Akunin, then we can be in the right mind frame to start to feel the need to build ourselves up, because it's going to start with self-power practices. Then I think Shin Buddhism creates a space where higher power or other power can come into our lives. But instead of condemning us, instead of saying all those bad things you did is your fault, it says because you've done these bad things, enlightenment is given to you even more. Sorry, we'll skip powerlessness versus selflessness. I think free will is kind of important to bring up. So does everyone think we have free will, or does everyone believe in karma and dependent co-arising, or some weird spectrum in the middle? Because we're Buddhists, it's not ever an extreme. So Sam Harris talks about, it's on the internet, on YouTube, free will does not work in his mind as a Buddhist. No one in the audience, and this is him saying, if I'm telling all of you too, would any of you choose to be a serial killer? Probably not. So then he says, is a serial killer choosing to be a serial killer? Is it because of things happen in this person's life to make him this way? To quote him, to say the killer would or could have done otherwise had he chosen to do so is simply to say, well, if he lived in a different universe, he would be in a different universe. Harris admits that the behavior sickens him, but he also admits that if he traded places with a serial killer, he would be the killer. There's no part of him that could resist the impulse to victimize innocent people. He then talks about, for people who believe in an immortal soul, they're also not safe from this aspect. He says he cannot take credit for the fact he does not have the soul of a psychopath. Had he been the killer, then he too would have behaved the same way for the same reasons. This is why I prefer to not use the idea of free will. Again, I'm not saying that that's wrong, just in the Buddhist context. I like the idea of dependent co-arising or karma. It arises, things arise in our past, and it influences us. We only know that to be true, but there's also forgiveness and change, because after today, we're all going to be different people, because we've sat through a lecture. Whether we like the lecture or not, we've still been changed. Another person had talked about Buddhist psychology's basic problem salvation is purifying the mind of evil. The mind, or sita in its modes, contaminant states, or kaita, need to be analyzed to learn how to overcome greed, hatred, and delusion. And again, I think in Jodo Shinshu, we can't do that, but we can be transformed by other power. I'm going to skip ahead. Did I go through the evil person? Well, no, we should probably do the serenity prayer. Has everyone heard this? Grant me serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. That's pretty common in addiction recovery. Moving into that again, the evil or first foolish person. This is supposed to be who Amida Buddha directs the mirror to the most, or first. They're the focus of boundless compassion before the good people. And I think that's important to understand in Jodo Shinshu. Saved by the inconceivable working of Amida's vow, I shall realize birth in the Pure Land. When we entrust to the vow, we are immediately brought to share in the benefit of being grasped by Amida, never to be abandoned. I think we've probably heard this before, but again, do we buy into what it means and live our lives through this idea. In a perfect world, of course, all Shin Buddhists would be perfect at this. We wouldn't need to start self-exploration, but this is not the reality. So what do we as priests have to do to bring down the teaching? Remembering that those need to hear this might just need gentle nudging at first so we don't break who they are, themselves, their constructed selves, their perceived worldviews. If we can do this right or skillfully and not damage their sense of self, then they won't suffer alone because they'll trust us and they can come to us and talk to us. Again, like me, I can't tell these priests that like I'm hanging out with cartel members and like, my friends are doing all these drugs because I thought that would make me not good enough to come inside the Buddhist church. I didn't feel comfortable opening up to them, but again, for some people, when an addict kicks rock bottom, things need to be addressed and things need to be skillfully done in a more time-sensitive, or maybe, I don't like using the word accusatory, but like you have to point out that like the way you're going, you're going to die. And the Tanisha Shinran states, even a good person attains birth in the Pure Land, how much more so an evil person? Again, in Shin, we usually use foolish beings or bonbu, but in Shinran's own writings, he uses this term evil person in reference to himself. I think then that the Akunin should be the term used for addiction recovery work. I believe, I know that addicts, we, they, all of us do evil acts and think in an evil way. Their evil can be described as rooted in the ego's three poisons, greed, anger, and ignorance. But again, in a roundabout way, Shin Buddhism could be helpful if people considered that they weren't being ethical in their motives. But of course, for any kind of change, they would need to understand they were grasped by this power, recognizing you're reborn because of your imperfect self. I think that that's going to start a contact. And if we were going to supplement the Shin Buddhist recovery model, it's important again to know that the primal vow of Amida makes no distinction between people young and old, good and evil. Only Shinjin is essential. For it is the vow to save the person whose karmic evil is deep and grave and whose blind passions abound. So I think this is a very strong point or point of contact with Shin Buddhism in the recovery program. That's where the Tanisha overlaps with it, I believe at least. If one admits they are who the vow was created for, knowing they were powerless over the condition or their addiction, and had done things in their past to serve their addiction, to be self-serving, and now are at the end of their wits at rock bottom, and at the time had never admitted defeat, perhaps in that moment, recovery programs in Jodo Shinshu Buddhism could then be useful. I think we need to change our focus as Americans, as Shin Buddhists living in the West, as the idea of the white knight in shining armor, the good person of the story. I think when we can start to self-reflect and at least see some aspects of how we're not perfect people, perhaps that's where spirituality would start to begin. I think we've been socialized to think about saintliness and the greater good and good vanquishes evil, but in Shin Buddhism, it's the evil that kind of allows a religion to happen. I've had many interactions with people from my temple friends who have said, well, Landon, you're misrepresenting Jodo Shinshu's Buddhism. You don't really know what you're talking about. You shouldn't have gone to IBS, or you shouldn't have been accepted into IBS, or how are you a priest? There's a misunderstanding that they think that I'm taking Christian ideas because entrustment in faith, other power, could seem like grace from God maybe, and they're saying, you think Christianity is Buddhism, but you're wrong. This has come from very devoted temple members, people who believe doing good will get them enlightenment, and ideas like Shinjin and Akunin are not really part of Shin Buddhism. But these are like the most devout people. They show up, they do all the work, they spend their own money. So they're wrong in our orthodoxy, but the lived religious experience, they're still practicing Jodo Shinshu. It's just come in a roundabout way. But again, if they don't understand things that we're talking about here, they can have the deep appreciation, and yet maybe academically or consciously, they don't really know what's going on. In closing, my belief is that Buddhist recovery models are probably more popular, and I'll admit, this is heresy, work better than what we could possibly do as Jodo Shinshu Buddhists, because all the other programs use other forms of Buddhism, and there's a process and a practice to actively work for, and that's what we need as Americans or people growing up in the West. Shin Buddhism, however, is very heady. It does not force the need to understand Shinjin or faith or entrustment, and I think that's a problem. Shinran writes to abandon the mind of self-power and trust into the name of great wisdom and to the vow of unhindered light while burdened with blind passions, attain supreme nirvana. So, in Jodo Shinshu, we're the fullest beings. We're considered to be the lowest of the low in the grades of Buddhist practitioners. Again, I know I'm saying this over and over. If we awaken to this fact, that's where a change starts to happen. We can start to reflect on this specific aspect of our religion, but it's okay then to admit that we're not perfect. I'm not going to be a good person. I mean, I don't even think I should be up here as a priest giving this lecture. But I do think that through this process, people can start to change, and it begins with being transformed by Amita's light. I guess I haven't been paying attention to this. Sorry. So this was just chapter 1, and the original chapter 1 was like 70 pages. I had to turn in a different chapter. As an idiot, I did my thesis and changed my thesis statement and didn't tell my committee, so I had to kind of reformat my thesis in like a 3-week period. Same idea, I just had to change some of the focus. In conclusion for this chapter, I claim that the notion of Akunin, or evil person, can provide a meaningful bridge between Shin Buddhist ideology and the 12-step program. Griffin's and Rowe's observations on step 1 of the Four Noble Truths were examined in detail, and I tried to provide commentary from a Jodo Shinshu perspective, using little tricks that I've learned from mental health, cultural anthropology, my work as a social worker and case management person, and addiction and recovery purposes, to try to find a way that I could feel comfortable using as an approach into bridging these gaps if someone came up to me and said, hey, I am in recovery and I have problems with this language or this idea, because I would not say you should just be Jodo Shinshu and just come to the temple because you'll be fixed. It's not how it works, but I would like to then hopefully be able to supplement some of their ideas so they don't leave the program, because an issue with one thing, which comes up in a lot of the drug authors' work, they say if you don't like this idea, it doesn't matter. Just if you like everything else, please stay in the program, because like one day at a time. My next chapter, if I was ever going to do another thing, would look at further commentary from the other Buddhist recovery models, but also including Griffin and Rowe's. And then I kind of go more into Shin Buddhism later. I imagine that some people didn't know what we were talking about as Shin Buddhists, and so I tried to use maybe things in Buddhism that are more general or kind of across the board, but we would want to implant Shin Buddhism later. A minister once asked me after Kyoshi, I picked him up from the airport, and he asked how my thesis was going. So I told him what I was going to do, water down the Jodo Shinshu teachings a lot, but use my other skill sets, because I'm not the best academic person, and he was upset. Like, why would we give you teaching certification? We had it done in America. It was the first time. Why did we do all that work for you to like kind of bring down the Buddhist practices? And I said, well, I respect you as a teacher, but also, what's worse, your temple member being addicted to crystal meth, or me not being the most academic person anyway, and just changing it and loosening it up? And he was kind of like, well, obviously crystal meth's a problem. And I said, you know, if this worked and you had this thesis, you could supplement that person's Christian or Buddhist or whatever, and you use the same language that I talked about, and you could call me, and I don't give you the name, but focus on person X is this, try not to bring up this, and you can work together with that person, and when they're sober and hopefully off crystal meth, are not using it as much, and they trust you as the head minister, then you can slowly implant these things. I'm not the most academic person, but most of the ministers are. So that was the hope. Thank you for listening today. Did I go like way over an hour?
No.
Well, thank you for your time, and I guess we'll be around for questions after this, right? Thank you.
Thank you.